Welcome back, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'm going to do the real knocking this time. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you again, Ambassador, for the lovely, lovely lunch. We've had some time to talk and network and meet each other. And now we're going to start the second half of today's event. If there's a little bit of feedback, let me know. We are going to start with a little bit of just how we're going to contextualize this second half of the conference. We're going to hear from Tilman, who is at a museum in West Telemark, and he's going to share a story about the Red River Girl. And then we're going to hear from the younger generation. I think part of who we want to be in this world is not just about the politicians or the researchers, but each one of us in terms of who are we and who do we want to be? How do we want to serve? How do we want to welcome? And I think it is very important that we have the inclusion of the younger voices. So we're going to share amazing work and presentations of the scholarship winners towards the end of today. So the next person is, again, Tilman Hartenstein. He's going to present on the Red River Girl. He and I had a long conversation last Friday at the very end of the day. And I think you had a presentation in mind that totally changed throughout our conversation, which is part of how we work, right? Some presentations work in certain forums, and then it has to change to be this way. And I think we actually had a really great conversation, so I'm excited about what you've come up with. It was pretty clear that he needed to redo certain things, so I think he was busy the whole weekend. So one of the things that Tilman told me is he also wanted to acknowledge one of his co-workers, and that is Astrid Katrine Draugedal Bjørgum, in terms of just being an ally in the work. So we want to thank you as well for the work that you're doing. So the journey of the life of second-generation Norwegian immigrant, Orabel, is what we're going to hear about next. I think it's important that we tie this to the identity on the line research, too, in terms of the traumatic experiences some of our immigrants have, but also how you carry on the history that you come to the new place with, and also how people identify you and how you create your own identity. I'm going to give the word to you right now, so we're excited about having you come up here and share the work that you're doing in your museum. Please welcome Mr. Hartenstein.
Thank you, Bettine, for the nice introduction. I saw in the program I was titled Communications Manager. That's nice. Actually, I look at myself more than a kind of hands-on exhibition producer or something like that. So thanks for the promotion. And actually, as you can see in my name, I'm not Norwegian. And in the same way that Katrin talked before me, I came from Germany to Norway many years ago, I suppose. You too? Yeah. I hope this is a mere coincidence. Actually, what I want to say is fitting very well in what you were talking about. And especially your mentioning of the second generation migrants. Even if the migration I will talk about was not forced, but it was actually voluntary from Norway to the US. But when it comes to the second generation, and maybe even the third generation, they could not choose what their parents chose. So they, in a way, they were forced anyway. So the problems and the results are quite the same, actually. While I was sitting here and you were talking, I was thinking about some quotes that I remember from earlier. I wrote it down here. It is from the French philosopher Simone Weil. She was called the philosopher of rootlessness, actually. And she was talking about she was saying to be rooted is a need of the human soul. And on the other hand, when this root is taken away from you, then you can experience a traumatic state of being nothing but human. So everything is taken away from you, but what you're left is that you're a human. Maybe also a woman or a man, as you said. So I think this is a kind of, could be a kind of heading for this presentation of mine. First, I have to do it like this. Yeah, it works. Woo! First, I'll tell you something very short about our museum. Not anybody knows of West Telemark Museum. It's in the upper Telemark, in the mountains, halfway between Oslo and Bergen. And actually, we administer 11 museums, big ones and small ones, in upper Telemark. And we also have 2 churches that we have guided tours to, and we have 8 major art collections. And part of the 11 museums are so-called bygdetun, which is a different term to translate to English. It's a kind of open-air museum, mostly from the first part of the 20th century, where different historical buildings were gathered. So there are quite a lot of them in Norway, and we have some of them too. Our museum deals with issues that often are called genuine Norwegian culture. You see it here. Folk music, bunad, that is folk costumes, knife making, rose painting, silversmithing, and things like this. And I think these are elements that are part of the, maybe you could call it a Norwegian ethnicity, at least in the 20th century maybe, or 19th century actually. It was very important parts of what was called Norwegian. And the reason for that is, of course, that the politicians, before the Norwegian independence in 1905, they were traveling from Christiania, which was the name of Oslo at that time, to Telemark because it was nearby. So in a way that was quite unjust, because they forgot about all the coastline and the west coast of Norway, and forgot, of course, about northern Norway. So in a way it's unjust, but that's how it is. So we are dealing with this notion of genuine Norwegian culture. Here you see our museums. They are quite dispersed on a big area. To drive from Arabygdi down to Fyresdal takes 1.5 hours with a car. So the big question is, and it was our starting point for that project, how can a dispersed and rural museum that focuses on folk art and rural culture address the issue of migration, ethnicity, and identity? Of course, we have a lot of immigrants in Upper Telemark, most of them from other Western countries and Scandinavian countries, and they are completely integrated and very invisible. You cannot really see them. And then we have some small communities of refugees from other countries too. But how can we understand them better? Of course, we had some more traditional exhibitions, for example, different folk costumes from different parts of the world, also food diversity. We had a project some years ago. But the question we were asking in 2018 was, can we learn something about immigrants to Norway by following Norwegian immigrants to another country? In a way, the other way around. So what we actually have in Upper Telemark is a long history of emigration, and especially to the US. So that's when we started the Red River Girl project. This is the book that was the result of the project. I can show it to you. It's quite big and heavy, like this. And it's a fantastic collection of material, paintings, writings, and I will tell you more about it. I have some copies here if someone wants to get it afterwards, but not more than five because they're so heavy. Of course, I can send you more if you want. The project started with the support of Fyresdal kommune and the county and the foundation of Fritt Ord. And that's when we also started cooperation with Dawn. Thank you for that. The reason we started the project was a coincidence, because we heard about that there was a collection of incredible lot of material about the Norwegian emigration or immigration to the north of Minnesota in a place called Hjemkomstmuseum, which is a little museum in Moorhead, north in Minnesota, and which is owned by the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County. So we spoke to them, and they got into the project as our partners. Orabel Thortvedt is the girl you can see on the cover of the book. And here you can see something about her. American artist, writer, and local historian, devoted much of her life depicting the migration story of her family. Well, she had roots to Fyresdal, which I showed you on the recent slide, which is quite south in Upper Telemark. And she was second-generation immigrant. So she didn't emigrate herself, but actually, or also her father was he was a child when the migration took place. It was actually her grandfather taking the initiative. I'll tell you more about that. Here she is, as an art student in Minneapolis in the 1930s. She was about 30 years old then, and she had a hearing impairment. So, and that's why actually she got this scholarship to study art in Minneapolis, because of her impairment. So it was quite a coincidence that she could do that. There. In the attic of the Thortvedt farm, I will tell you more about that later, she had a working place, like you see here. It was her secret space. The photo is from 1941, and here she typed down and painted and drew over and over again the same story, the story of the migration of her family. So there are actually thousands of drawings, paintings, photographs, documents, a lot of material that never had been published before in that archive in Moorhead in Minnesota. Here we see her painting an iconic picture of her grandfather, Olav Geitestad, what was his name. I have the dates here. Okay, I can go back. If you look at the picture, you can see what kind of man Orabel thought he was. In a way, he was a kind of maybe a kind of god, actually. He was charismatic, responsible, visionary, real family patriarch. If you had asked Orabel, what is your ethnicity? I think she had said it's, of course, Norwegian with a big N. Because everything in her life just was connected to being Norwegian. But actually, when we were working our way through this material, we found out that maybe we have to deconstruct this a little. And I'll show you why. There was also a very, very strong psychological state of mind at Orabel's, in Orabel's mind, that was connected to being a second-generation migrant more than Norwegian. Because being a second-generation migrant is of course not connected to one special ethnicity. It's universal. Here we have his gravestone at the Lutheran, I think it's the name of the church at the Lutheran Church in Glyndon, which is nearby the town of Moorhead at the border of northern Minnesota, not far from Fargo. This is how Urabel imagined the departure of the family from Tvedestrand with this old Russian sail ship. I don't think it looked like this, but it's a very romantic idea. And that's in a way a kind of symbol for how she managed with all this, the storytelling she was experiencing as a child, because her grandfather, her grandparents, and also her father did tell her a lot about that migration, and she, in a way, made her own pictures out of that. Why did they emigrate? I'll not say much about that, but there are, of course, many reasons. And usually we call it for both pull factors and push factors. And the push factors were, of course, population increase, bad crops for several years, and great poverty, especially among tenant farmers at that time. The pull factors were in the 1860s, people in Norway heard about that there would be a new law in the US called the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act said that all men or women above 21 years, American or not, should have the right to claim up to 160 acres of free land. And that was not just free land, it was actually rock-free black soil. You know what that means in a country as Norway? That was a fantastic dream for a tenant farmer. 160 acres of black soil without rocks. So, of course, they left to get a better life. And Urabel's family was not alone, actually. From Fyresdal, that year in 1861, I think there were more than 100 persons leaving the community, about 5% of the population. In Vinje, a neighbor community, it was even worse. I think it was nearly 12% that year. So you can imagine what kind of mass migration it must have been at that time. Almost all emigrants from Fyresdal traveled to the same place. It's a place called Moorhead Prairie in Houston County in Minnesota. It's quite in the south. So they traveled to Canada and from there with a railway to the south of Minnesota. Why did they do that? Why did they gather together at the same space? Oh, I have to move on. 5 minutes left. Well, okay. Of course, this is a kind of very important thing to gather together some place in the new country you're coming to, because you have to maintain your mental health, of course. But in 1870, Olaf's family moved on from Houston to the Wild West. So they actually went on. I have to just drop some slides here. I'm sorry. You can see here is the migration from Houston and to the north of Minnesota, as Urabel imagined it. And in July 1870, the Thortwets claimed homeland at the Buffalo River in Clay County. And there is the farm still today, the Thortwet farm. They built a house and started farming. And you see all these pictures are taken from the material we found at the archive. She painted a lot of pictures about the farm work. She experienced the hardships of a typical immigrant family, building up their existence. One example was when the farmhouse burned down in 1899. and they had to start all over again. At the same time, there was a community growing around the farm, because in 1874 the railway came nearby, and what happened was that there was an urbanization taking place that ended up in the town of Moorhead, that is still there today, of course. But the family's focus remained on the farm. Here you can see the farm again. I think the photo must be from before the house burned, and I think maybe Urabel is maybe that one, because she was 3 or 4 years old when the house burned. As I told you, in 1930, Urabel was 34 years old and became a student of art and specialized in animal painting. You can see it here. This is a kind of how she imagined how it could be in Norway before they emigrated. This is a place called Skåri in Fyresdal, and you see the wolves coming down from the woods. It's not sure it really was like this, but it's her imagination. Actually, she got her own atelier in Minneapolis, and she got a wealthy group of customers buying pictures from her, so she had the chance to establish herself as an artist in Minneapolis. But she didn't. So what happened? In 1936, both parents died, and Urabel returned to the farm, staying there with unmarried siblings for about 50 years. And she died in 1983. So that's in a way a tragic story. But of course, in these 50 years, she was not completely involved with only farm work. She did all this production of paintings and writings and documentation in that time. Here she is, 2 years before she died. So let me say something about her identity and about ethnicity in that connection. The ethnicity part, the Norwegian part of her thinking was, of course, connected to nostalgia, because she was never in Norway by herself. She had never experienced the Norwegian society, so she had only books and stories and photographs to help herself how she could imagine the Norwegian past. Here you can see it. She, of course, idealized Norway. It was not longer a country of hardship and poverty, but it was a hardship of wonder and harmony and dancing. And this very often is the case, I think, when it comes to second-generation immigrants, because the first generation, they embrace the new community they come to, because they know what they left behind. The second generation, and maybe also the third, they experience a kind of need to assimilate. And maybe they react on that need by idealizing the country that their parents went from. So this is very, very typical for many Norwegian Americans, and especially for Urabel. The second thing in her mind were strong memories of 2 childhoods with hope and dreams for the future. It was her father's and her own. Here you see a depicting of the story that her father told her when they were traveling along the Red River from Houston to north to Minnesota. They met the famous Red River carts, and this is a kind of depicting of that. They were Indians, so-called Indians, that also had French parents, and who had a kind of culture of transporting things along the Red River. And she called them half-breeds, and that was usual at that time. Here we see a sculpture she made at an age of 14 or 15 at the Red River clay, out of Red River clay, and she started to call herself Red River Girl. So what's this notion of strong memories of two childhoods? I think it's about the notions of moving on, working to build up a life, creating a new home, getting to a better life, a very, very strong notion of hope and hope for the future. So that was very strong for her. At the same time, she was neglecting the world outside the Norwegian-American community. She had only Norwegian neighbors. She actually talked quite badly Norwegian. So she was, in a way, trying to improve her Norwegian by doing long lists about Norwegian, expressions and terms that she used all the time. So she stayed at the farm for her whole life and neglected what was going on outside. And that's also true about politics. This is a very famous picture by John Gast from 1872 that shows the Western civilization, Colombia, is moving forward to bring civilization to the Wild West, and to the indigenous people fleeing here, as you can see. And Orabel never doubted that ideology, actually. She was against slavery, and she did support the fight for the rights for black people in the US, but she did never connect to the indigenous people's rights movement. Indians were nothing that existed actually for her. And last not least, she had a shame of not being a genuine American. And that's even more strange, because she was not thinking about indigenous people being the right Americans, the genuine Americans. No. The genuine Americans were actually maybe the Irish ones that came to America 150 years before the Norwegian ones. So that was a problem, and she writes about that. She says, as I grew older, I felt that these persons thought they were the genuine Americans. I could not understand it because I was born here. Here you see your family, and she is here on the right. So she was quite a complicated mind, actually. And it was a kind of tragic story. But of course, she created all this wonderful material. So we had to use a lot of displays in the exhibition to explain her state of mind. So here is a kind of overview. Her mind has 4 layers. It was nostalgia, childhood memories, neglecting the outside world, and shame of not being a genuine citizen. Edward Said has said once that migration can cause a generalized condition of homelessness, he said. And I think that's maybe what she deepest inside experienced and tried always to compensate for. So this fantastic material was shown in an exhibition which was shown on several places. You can see up here in Norway, in Eidsborg, at our museum, and then on the right side in Moorhead, in the Gjenkomst Museum there, and then also in a local historic museum in Houston, in the south of Minnesota. And actually, our museum got a heritage award. You see here on the right side, we have a nice. I think it's a kind of glass thing that was sent from from the US to us. It's the Clay County Heritage Award. So that was nice. So I like this quote very much because it gives maybe a kind of comfort. Everyone comes from somewhere else. So I think if one understands what the state of mind of Orabel Tortvedt, I think you can understand a lot about yourself. And me being an immigrant by myself, I have also some experience of the same thing. Being homeless in a way, looking for something to connect to. And here is my last picture is from the archive in Moorhead. On the right side is Mark Peel, an eminent archivist who helped us with this huge material. It took us about 2 years to go through it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that story with us. I think it's amazing that one person's story has taken 2 years to go through. And I think it's also very interesting to think about identity being created based on your forefathers. You were actually born in a country, but you're creating a reality that is based on stories told and maybe a wish of something that was before. I also want to say that, yes, the Norwegian immigration to the United States were maybe not forced, but it was out of necessity for some people. And you didn't just come to land. You actually stole land. And I want to just say that, too, because I think we have this idea that Norwegians came and people came to the Americas, and there were just all this land available. It wasn't available necessarily. It was stolen, and it was bought. So I just want to say that because there's a traumatic experience for those who are maybe a little bit different nowadays. But in terms of when the immigration happened, the trauma that was put upon the Native American societies and communities in the United States is still continuing. So I think, too, we need to think about what countries feel when they are experiencing something that is just taking over. I also want to say I'm an immigrant to the United States. I grew up in Norway. I moved into Minneapolis-St. Paul, where there's a huge community of Norwegians. I am almost looked upon as a royal, right? Because I'm real Norwegian. But I'm also, fighting this identity that you talked about in terms of who they think I am, right? And there is the lusekofte, there is the lefse, there is all of that still. And I'm like, that's not Norway anymore. And do we need to hold on to that? Yeah, maybe we do. But there's also another side to that story. I hope that we will find treasures like Orabel's in this country in a few years of new immigrants to this country, and that museums actually will take the time to dig through that work and create a 5-part book of that story. I really do.